All right, ladies and gentlemen, this is going to be our next lesson in Unit 3, which is land-based empires. Today, we start to move over to the east. So in our previous lessons, we looked at what was going on in Europe. We saw what was going on during the Protestant Reformation. We saw all of the problems with that. Today, we're going to continue talking about a religious element that persists in all of these societies, but this time it's not going to be Christianity. It's going to be, let me move that up a little bit for you guys. It's going to be Islam. And these Islamic empires are going to be known as the gunpowder empires because, as you could assume, they're going to use gunpowder in order to expand their empire. So, right off the bat, we already have a method that these societies use in order to centralize themselves. Let's go ahead and move on here. Once again, our essential questions are: how did land empires expand? We've already seen land empires expand during this time period in Europe. For example, we saw Ferdinand and Isabella expand their land empire and drive the Moors out of Spain. This time we're going to see how Muslims are going to expand their land empires. Number two, what methods did land-based empires use to centralize their rule? I already gave one: gunpowder. We'll see others as well. And number three, how was religion used to unite? And how was it used to divide? We'll see examples of both today. We'll see religion being used to unite people. We'll see religion that is used to divide people. So we'll see examples of religious tolerance and intolerance. By the end of our synchronous session, we will go ahead and compare all three of the gunpowder empires that we are going over today. Let's go ahead and begin. The first person we're going to start with is Tamerlane, or Timur for those of you who prefer to call him that. Tamerlane was this Mongol Turkic ruler in the late 14th century. So now we're talking in the middle of the 1300s and then into the very, very beginning of the 1400s. Now, Tamerlane saw himself as a descendant of Genghis Khan. He wasn't, but that's how he pictured himself. You have to remember that when Tamerlane is taking over and Tamerlane's living, the Mongol Empire has already become this massive empire and then has already broken apart. We saw the different pieces in which the Mongol Empire was broken apart. We saw the Ilkhanate in the Middle East, what was the Abbasid Caliphate. We saw the Golden Horde in Russia, the Yuan dynasty, and what we called the Song dynasty in China. Tamerlane says, I'm the guy who's going to put it all back together. I'm the guy who's going to connect everything, and I'm going to bring back the glory of the Mongol Empire. The problem is that he dies before he is able to do so. He engages in a winter campaign, doesn't survive through the winter, dies in, I believe, the very beginning of the 1400s, around the year 1405 or so. Now, for us, here's why we need to know about Tamerlane. His conquest used gunpowder and used cannons, all of these new technologies that were coming from the east. Remember, we did our reading about southernization. We talked about gunpowder. We showed how gunpowder and cannons traveled via trade from the east all the way over to the west. Tamerlane is taking advantage of that. He's using gunpowder in order to take control. Other people are going to copy him, namely our three societies that we are looking at today. Let's go ahead and start with our first society, which is our major one. This is the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire is very important for us to understand, and oftentimes is not talked about enough in history. So we'll go ahead and spend a bit of time looking at the Ottoman Empire. Remember, the Abbasid Caliphate was there in the Middle East, but then in 1258, Hulagu Khan comes in with the Mongols and destroys Baghdad. If you think back to our Mongol readings, we looked at H.G. Wells. And H.G. Wells was that sci-fi writer who wrote about War of the Worlds. He saw the Mongols come in and completely destroy Baghdad. So that's the end of the Abbasid Caliphate. Well, when the Abbasid Caliphate goes away, the Ilkhanate is there, but the Ilkhanate starts to decline and go away as well. Something needs to take its place, and that's going to be the Ottoman Empire. The first thing we need to know about the Ottoman Empire is they are Sunni Islam. They're Sunni Muslims. We don't need to know anything specific about Sunni Islam. And so I'm not really going to get into that. But what we do need to know is that there's going to be a different type of Islam in just a little bit, and that's going to cause a whole lot of conflict there. Now, the Ottoman Empire is founded under Osman in the year 1299, or really the year 1300. But it really starts as this very, very small society. I mean, it's absolutely tiny. No one really thinks it's going to become this massive, large empire that's going to have people worried about it, but eventually it does. Slowly, throughout the next 200 years or so, it starts to get bigger and bigger. That is until we get to Mehmed II, or Mehmed the Conqueror. At this point, the Ottoman Empire becomes a force to reckon with. Here's what Mehmed the Conqueror does. He rolls in his cannons. He takes his cannons and he goes to the city of Constantinople. And him and his men are standing outside of Constantinople, and they have their cannons all lined up, pointed at Constantinople. The year is 1453. If you'll remember, Constantinople was the location of the Fourth Crusade. So Constantinople is fairly weak, because if you remember, those Crusaders sacked Constantinople and really started to take it down. So Constantinople is pretty weak, but it's still incredibly important. It's still this area of trade. Remember, Constantinople, and I'll show you on the map in just a little bit here, Constantinople exists with the trans-Saharan trade routes and the Silk Road. It exists in that Bosporus Strait there. If you have Constantinople, you're pretty much at the center of the world, because you have all of this trade occurring right in your city. So whoever owns Constantinople has a whole lot of power. Well, Mehmed the Conqueror turns to his men who are manning the cannon and says, boys, go ahead and fire. They fire that cannon. That cannonball hits the wall. The wall is completely destroyed. His soldiers march in. His soldiers take over. They take Constantinople and they rename it Istanbul. This is what puts the Ottoman Empire on the map. This is huge for the Ottoman Empire. I cannot overstate how important this is, because this is just a changing of everything. You're taking a Christian city called Constantinople, and now you've changed it into a Muslim city called Istanbul. This is going to scare European Christians. From here on out, European Christians are going to be frightened by the power of Islam that they see to the east. Why is it that Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand are so serious about driving the Moors out of Spain? It's because they're afraid of Muslims. They're afraid of this Muslim power of the Ottoman Empire. Why is it that Columbus will eventually set sail? Well, some historians think Columbus set sail and went to the Atlantic Ocean because he eventually wanted to get all the way around the world and fight the Muslims. So any decision that Europeans make from here on out is in part due to the Ottoman Empire. I'm not going to say it's entirely due to them, but one aspect, one motivation, one incentive behind their decision is because of what the Ottoman Empire is doing to the east. Now, what Mehmed the Conqueror does is he's going to be very close to the Empire of Venice, or the city of Venice. He will force the Venetians in modern day Italy to pay tribute. So right there, that's a method of centralization. We already know that from Unit 1. And so in Unit 3, we see that again. The other big thing that Mehmed the Conqueror is going to use, and other Ottoman sultans will use, is the iltizam, or the tax farming. All this is that the farmers are going to have to pay taxes, and the workers in the cities are going to have to pay taxes. So that's fairly straightforward. Taxes and tribute, that's a method of centralization. That's nothing new. But what is a little bit different is this picture right here. This is the Topkapi Palace in Constantinople, which is the residence of the sultans. Think back to our study of Europe. We looked at the Palace of Versailles that was expanded upon by King Louis XIV in order to inspire awe in the people. That's what this palace is for as well. It is meant to inspire awe, and so the people look at it and say, wow, that's absolutely amazing. Now, you might look at all this and say, okay, is this beneficial for them? Were they successful in centralizing their empire? Well, look at the years right up here. The Ottoman Empire is going to be around for over 600 years. I mean, we're talking about the 1400s right now. We'll be talking about the Ottoman Empire when we get to World War I in Unit 7 at the very end of the year. So yes, they were entirely successful because of their centralizing efforts. Let's go ahead and move on here. Now we have to get to a couple of the other sultans here. The first one is Selim I. Selim is known as Selim the Grim. Let's rewind just a little bit here in order to better understand Selim. Before Selim, the Sultan was Bayezid, which is an odd name, and they did not get it right in the closed caption down here. Bayezid was Sultan. Now, he had three sons. Those three sons came from three different wives. We have to remember that at this time, the sultans and most men are able to take multiple wives. That is not an unusual thing. That is completely normal. Most sultans had a harem full of women that were their wives. And we'll talk about that a bit later when we talk about the harem politics. Now, his three sons were Korkun, Ahmed, and then Selim. Now, Ahmed was the oldest, and so it looked like Ahmed was going to be the new sultan once Bayezid passed away. Selim started to realize this. Selim started to realize that Ahmed was going to take the throne, and Ahmed was going to be the sultan, and Selim started to become envious. He started to become jealous. He didn't think Ahmed or Korkun were that great of people or that great of leaders. He thought he was a great leader. And you know what? If you look at Selim's history, yeah, he's actually a really good leader. He really has a good understanding of how to work with people. But more importantly, he is more than willing to use the military in order to get his way. And so what Selim does is he goes up to his father Bayezid and he says, "You are going to give up your throne." Bayezid laughs at him and says, "No, I'm not. I am the Sultan. You have to obey me." Selim says, "Okay." And he wants in his entire army of men and holds Bayezid, his own father, at gunpoint and says, "Do you want to rethink the decision you just made?" And Bayezid says, "Okay, well, you can go ahead and have the throne then. I will just go to a different city then." Bayezid just wants to get out there. Bayezid is not as tough. He is not as manly, we'll say, as Selim. So Bayezid is taken off the throne. Now, as he leaves the city, he is poisoned and ends up dying. Many people believe that Selim was the one responsible for his poisoning. Now, you might think, great for Selim. He was able to kill his father, allegedly kill his father, and take the throne. Now everything's good for him, but not true. He has those two half brothers, Ahmed and Korkun, and they have their own armies, and they are ready to try to take the throne from Selim as well. Selim uses his armies to kill both of his brothers and claim the throne for himself. This is why he is called Selim the Grim. He kills members of his own family in order to rise to power. What this shows us, what this story shows us, is a few different things. One was the harem politics, this idea that the sultans could take many wives, and those wives are going to have an influence on the sultans themselves. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. But secondly, it shows this idea of unigeniture. We talked about primogeniture earlier, in which the first son, whoever's the oldest, is the one who inherits the throne. That one's pretty common and pretty usual. We even looked at the Mongol Empire that gets split up because they want to give a part to each of the sons, everyone who can make a claim. The Muslims have unigeniture, which is the Ottoman Empire has to stay together. You cannot fracture it up amongst all of these sons or all of the descendants. But it's not primogeniture, which means any son can take it. So whenever a sultan dies, there's always like a 10 to 20-year war that occurs in order to figure out who the new sultan is. And so there's this big civil war that happens. It often happens. Even for Selim's son, Suleiman, he has to fight off various sons and various cousins and nephews and uncles who all want to claim the throne as well. Now, the reason Selim's so important, and I'll show you on the map in just a second here, is that the Ottoman Empire is going to greatly expand underneath Selim. It's going to expand to the east and take over the Safavids, who we'll talk about momentarily. It will expand a bit to the south and take over the Mamluks in Egypt, and then it will expand to the west and start to take over parts of North Africa. But ultimately, it is Suleiman who is considered to be the greatest sultan who's ever lived, because at this time, during his reign, this is considered to be the height of the Ottomans. Now, a lot of the reasons why this is considered to be the Ottoman Golden Age is because of what Selim did. But Suleiman himself was an incredibly good leader, an incredibly good military leader as well, as he marched through the Balkans and ended up almost taking Vienna. So he took over Hungary. He did not take Vienna in Austria, but he did at least force it to pay tribute to the Muslims. So let's go ahead and actually look at this map here, and then I'll hop back to the battles. So this is where the Ottoman Turks start out, this brown spot right here. That's the year 1300. And slowly they get larger and larger. If you look at the purple right here, these are the acquisitions under Mehmed II. The most important one being Istanbul, or what was formerly known as Constantinople. But it's ultimately under Selim and Suleiman that you have the biggest growth of the Ottoman Empire. Under Selim, we see that is an extension to the east over here, and we'll talk about this extension a bit more when we talk about the Safavids. And there's an extension all the way down to Mecca and Medina. This area right here was actually controlled by the Mamluk Sultanate, who we talked about all the way back in Unit 1. Now, the Mamluk Sultanate controlled Mecca and Medina, the two holiest sites in all of the Muslim faith. That's why it was so important for Selim to take these, because now Selim not only has all this land, but he can also have these holy areas and use the Muslim religion to continue to centralize his rule. By the end of his life, he was actually trying to take Morocco all the way out here, but he died before he was able to do so. Possibly poisoned, but we're not 100% sure on that. If you look at the acquisitions under Suleiman acquired this part right up here. You can understand why Europe is so scared of the Ottoman Empire. Look at them. Look how close they are. And Europeans were already afraid of the Islamic world. And we remember that from Unit 1 with the Crusades. So this is just going to make Europeans even more fearful. All right, let's jump back to these battles. Now, these two battles right here show the extent of the Ottoman Empire. The first one is the Battle of Moach, which is an odd way to spell that word, but that's how it is pronounced. The Ottomans defeat the Hungarians. They defeat the people of Hungary. They're unable to defeat Vienna. And so they're going to stop there. That was right about here. So that's where they're going to stop. That's their furthest extent. The other big battle is the Battle of Lepanto. This actually takes place in the Mediterranean Sea right here. The Battle of Lepanto is when Spain, the Italian states, and the Holy League, so a bunch of Catholic European countries came together in order to defeat the Ottoman navy and stop the Ottoman advancement into Europe. You can see that Europeans, because they all combined together, remember, these are all rivals with one another, because the Ottoman Empire is so big and so scary, and they combine together in order to attempt to stop them. But the Ottoman Empire is going to have a lot of power and a lot of control and cause a lot of European decisions to be made over the next few hundred years. We already looked at the map there. Now let's talk about governing this empire. How is it that they do so? The major one is the use of conquered people. Here's one thing that I actually did not go over and really should have talked about. The majority of people in this area of the world, you would think are Muslim, but at this point they're not. They're actually Christian, especially over here in the Balkans. So there's many Christians here being ruled by Muslims. Now, the Muslims could come in and impose their rule upon the Christians, but they're not going to do that. They're going to use the conquered people in order to benefit themselves. That system of using conquered people in order to benefit the Muslim Ottoman Empire is the Devshirme system. The Devshirme system is pretty easy. Take these young Christian boys, take them from their house. I mean, these Muslim soldiers would go in and say, that's a young Christian boy, about 7 or 8 years old. He's mine now. And the family would usually give him over. Sometimes they would get money in return. Sometimes they just wouldn't get killed as long as they gave their son over to the Ottoman Empire. Now, these Christian boys were slaves, but not in the way that we think of it. We often think of slavery as working in the field and picking cotton and all the things associated with the Atlantic slave trade. And we will talk about that later because that's an essential part of history. But these slaves were just slaves who did not have a choice in what work they were going to do. They were going to be converted to Islam, but instead of working in fields, they're going to be taught politics. They're going to be taught arts. They're going to be taught the military. These Christian boys are going to be given actually a very good education so they can be good servants for the Ottoman Empire. In fact, many of these Christian boys actually move up to fairly high positions in the Ottoman Empire, either becoming these military commanders or working directly with the Sultan themselves. Now, these military Christian boys, they're called janissaries. So if you were a Christian male serving in the Ottoman military, you were a janissary. And these are elite forces. They are trained incredibly well. And that's incredibly important because they are able to defeat so many other forces because they have really good training. We also see that within the Ottoman Empire, there's religious tolerance. So many of those Jews who are being expelled and kicked out of Spain, and many of the Moors who are being kicked out of Spain, are going to find home within the Ottoman Empire, because the Ottoman Empire is religiously tolerant of them. Now, granted, they're still going to tax Jews and they're going to tax non Muslims, but they will allow them to exist within the empire, unlike Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand. Another big part are the gender rules. Now, as we saw, men could take multiple wives, and so women were still seen as fairly inferior to men. But that doesn't mean they didn't have power. In what we call harem politics, people like Roxolana were able to have influence over the Sultan. Not necessarily like direct, it's not like they were making direct laws and engaging in politics, but they were able to talk to the Sultan and influence their decisions. Roxolana happened to be the wife of Suleiman, and many of the wives had influence over Suleiman and other sultans. The sultans' mothers usually had influence over them as well. So we see that these women had a lot of influence over the men that were supposed to be governing the society. And so we can use that as an example of women having some power within some of these empires that we're looking at. Another big part of centralizing your rule is architecture. We already saw the Topkapi Palace there, but another one is the Suleymaniye Mosque. Building these big mosques for the people makes people happy and makes people in awe of your splendor and your wealth. And so that's going to allow you to centralize your power there. We'll talk more about the decline when we get into Unit 7, or actually Unit 6 as well. We'll talk about the decline, but it's all the same things that exist in Conrad DeMar's model of part number 4. The empire gets too big, there's too many taxes, people get mad, they revolt. We'll talk about it in Unit 6. The big thing that I want you guys to look at as well are the changes in continuity. So the big changes are government and religion. No longer is it really a Christian area, especially Constantinople. It's no longer a Christian area. It's under Muslim rule, and it's no longer under the Abbasid Caliphate. It's under the Ottoman Empire. But there are some distinct continuities here. Constantinople, which is now Istanbul, is the center of learning. It's the center of the trade routes. And that's still going to be true under the Ottoman Empire. This part of the world is going to be the center of the known world. It's going to be where people trade, where there's a lot of wealth as well. Let's go ahead and move on to our other empire, which is the Safavid Empire here. So just to put you in perspective, or at least put you in the right spot, here's the Ottoman Empire over here. Remember, Europe's all the way over here. The Safavid Empire is right here. If you look at a modern day globe or a map, it's where Iran is. And that's going to be important in just a second here. Now let's talk about our big guy here, Ismail. This individual is of Azerbaijani and Iranian descent. So he is a Muslim, but he's not the same type of Muslim that the Ottoman Empire is. Remember, the Ottoman Empire is Sunni Islam or Sunni Muslim. Ismail is Shia or Shiite. Where does this come from? Well, Shia comes from Sufism. If you remember in Unit 1, Sufism was a combination of Islam with local religions. And so what we saw is that those local religions believed in many of the same things, but they did so in a slightly different way. That's where Shiite is coming from. It's a combination of all these Sufi religions that end up coming together that believe many of the same things that the Sunnis do, but believe it in a slightly different way. It's just like the Protestant religions. I mean, the differences between Catholicism and Lutheran and Calvinism might be minute to someone who's an outside viewer, but someone who is a part of those religions, those minute differences are incredibly important. And that's the difference between Shia and Shiite. So Ismail actually uses that religion in order to unite his people. He says, look, we're all Shia and we're distinctly not Sunni, so we should all come together and form an empire in order to defend ourselves from these Sunni Ottoman Empire. And so people are going to naturally gravitate towards that. In addition to that, Ismail, like many leaders, uses his stories. It's almost hagiographic, where he embellishes all the things he does in order to make himself look absolutely amazing, so people will think he's the greatest person in the world and bow down in front of him. Now, Ismail actually started ruling the empire when he was just 14 years old. So if you can imagine a tiny little redhead kid ruling an entire empire, then, well, yeah, that's what Ismail is. Let's see, 14 years old. That puts you at what, like eighth grade or freshman year, something around there. So yeah, imagine a little freshman, red hair sticking out of his head and everything, ruling an entire empire. That's who Ismail is. So he needs people to take him seriously. There is a story that he puts out. Is it true? I have no idea. I'm going to just choose to believe it is true because it's an interesting story. Ismail, as a 14-year-old, one time told people, you see that goat over there, real life goat. Take that goat, kill it, and bury it in the ground, but only let its horns stick out, just like this. Let them stick out about an inch or two. And so the men do so. They let the goat's horns stick out just like this. Ismail hops on his horse and says, "Watch this." He rides the horse at full gallop, bends down, picks up the horn with just one finger, grabs the entire goat out of the ground. Remember, the goat's buried in the ground, so he's moving all of that dirt, takes it above his head, swings it around 3 times, and then tosses it a good 30 yards in order to show off how physically strong he was as a 14-year-old. Is that true? Maybe. Maybe. I'm just going to choose to believe it is true because it is a good story, but he uses that story to get people to take him seriously. And that's why he's able to be Shah. That's why he is able to have all of the power there. We already talked about Shia and we already talked about Sunni as well. The last thing I want to talk about is that this conflict still goes on today. This part of the world, Iran and Iraq, there are many Shia Muslims living there. In this part of the world, Turkey, in the modern day, is very Sunni. This leads to a whole lot of conflict. And so you're going to see a question. There will be a question on the test about the Safavids and the Ottoman Empire and how that still causes conflict between Iran and Turkey today. So make sure you keep that in mind. It's because of the different ways in which they approach the Muslim religion. Let's go ahead and move on to this right here. So this is the map that I'm exactly talking about. Iran and Iraq are Shia majority, while these areas are Sunni majority. Obviously, that's going to lead to a bit of conflict. The first conflict we see is the Battle of Chaldiran in 1514. This is going to be the Safavids versus the Ottomans. Ottomans easily win this one. Selim, who is Sultan at this time, has the bigger cannons. He has the gunpowder. He has all of the Janissaries as well. He just has the better military. The Safavids have pretty weak military, and they have swords. And so guns are going to beat swords every single time. And so the Ottomans win. Now, the Safavids will survive. They're not completely destroyed. And this is in part because the Ottomans were actually incredibly tired. Selim the First, Selim the Grim, wanted to actually pursue Ismail and his Safavid army and completely destroy them. But his men said, no, we're sick and tired of fighting. We just want to go home. And so they go home, and the Safavid Empire does survive. However, they are incredibly weak, which is part of the reason why a majority of Muslims today are Sunni Muslims as opposed to Shia Muslims. This battle also shows the importance of gunpowder and how it was used to expand. Now, I will say that Ismail ends up drinking himself into a coma and almost to death after this battle because he really thought he was chosen by God, and he really thought that he could not be defeated. And this defeat, this horrible, terrible defeat, led him to a life of excess and drinking. And eventually he's going to be out of power, which is a huge hit to the Safavid Empire, which is why the Ottomans are the ones who remain so dominant and not the Safavids. In addition to engaging in military and using religion in order to centralize his rule, there's other methods of centralizing rule and governing the empire that exists. So Abbas the First, who is going to come after Ismail, actually uses personal troops, pretty similar to the Janissaries there, and also creates a theocracy of Shia Islam. A theocracy is a government that is run through a religion. We see a lot of governments run through religion during this time. For example, we have the divine right theory in Europe. It's a similar concept here with the theocracy in in the Safavid Empire. As we talked about after the Battle of Chaldiran, things go downhill really quick, and the Safavids are going to be out of power by the 1700s. Really, even before that, they are considered not a very strong empire at all. In addition to using personal troops, once again, we see architecture is used. So this is in the capital city of Isfahan. This was the capital of the Safavid Empire, and you see this massive mosque being built for the people. So that's another way in which people centralize their rule, is by using architecture there. Let's move on to our last gunpowder empire, which is the Mughal Empire. Now, Babur, right here, is a descendant of Tamerlane. I believe he's his great, great, great grandson. And what Babur is going to do is he's going to take over the Delhi Sultanate in India in 1526. Remember, this area right here was under the Delhi Sultanate. So northern India was under Muslim rule. Now, instead of being under the Delhi Sultanate, it's going to be under the Mughal Empire. So that's a big change, but a big continuity is that this area is still going to be majority Muslim. And as I've pointed out there, it's still under Muslim rule. So that's a massive continuity. This is how the Mughal Empire is going to govern their empire. Their most famous leader is going to be Akbar. Now, he's Babur's grandson, who what he does, what he's most famous for, is his religious tolerance. In this picture right here, we see Akbar, and he is surrounded by various types of religious people. He's surrounded by Muslims, he's surrounded by Christians, he's surrounded by Zoroastrianisms, he is surrounded by people of the Hindu religion as well. So he's very, very religiously tolerant. And one of his wives, remember, he is Muslim, so he can have multiple wives. One of his wives is a Hindu woman. So this very much shows religious tolerance on the part of Akbar. In addition to using that religious tolerance, he is going to have tax collectors, these zamindars. Remember, we talked about the intendants when we looked at Europe. We talked about the justices of peace as well, those who were supposed to go out and collect taxes for the king. It's the same exact thing here. The zamindars are in charge of taxing the people and collecting all the taxes and using it to actually construct new things and make sure that water is supplied to the people. In addition, you have Muslim merchants. Remember, Islam is considered to be the religion of travel and trade. And we already talked about the Indian Ocean Exchange. That's going to continue to exist underneath the Mughal Empire. Women in the Mughal Empire were seen as similar to the Safavids, very much lower than men. They're supposed to be veiled at all times. The men could take multiple wives. We've seen this time and time again. It's the same exact thing in the Mughal Empire as well. This is one I want to talk about right here because this is going to lead to some quick discussion and then we'll actually be done. So we're about 5 minutes out there. This is the Taj Mahal. We all know what the Taj Mahal is. I mean, this is one of the famous parts of India here. But what we may not know about the Taj Mahal is why it was built and for who and what the implications of it were. So one of Akbar's descendants was Shah Jahan. Now, Shah Jahan, one of his wives, was clearly his favorite wife. You have to remember, this guy has multiple wives. So one of his wives was clearly his favorite wife because this right here, the Taj Mahal, is a tomb for her. Now, this is a combination of both Islamic and Hindu architecture. You see the spires here, that's very Hindu. You see the domes, that's very Muslim, very Islamic there. And this costs a whole lot of money, as you would imagine, just for one of his wives. Now, I'll talk more about the Taj Mahal in just a second here. But ladies, if you're listening to this, if your man is not willing to completely destroy his country by taxing them and building a gigantic tomb for you, your man doesn't love you enough and you need to find a new man. Let's go ahead and move on. Before we get to why the Taj Mahal is so disastrous for the Mughal Empire, we need to talk about Sikhism. Sikhism is this new religion that comes out in the 15th century that combines Hinduism with Sufism, and that makes sense. I mean, after all, this is part of the world. This is in northern India, in which there are a lot of Hindus and there's a lot of Muslims. So it makes sense for them to engage in syncretism. Most notably, they are against the caste system. They're sick and tired of seeing the rich get richer and the poor stay poor. And they think, hey, this caste system is really, really horrible because it keeps people down and doesn't allow them to move up. They're also incredibly upset with all the taxes because they feel that they cannot survive. They feel that they already have so little money and then they get taxes taken from them, so they have even less money to survive. So they're really, really upset with the empire. Let's talk about the decline. It's very easy to look at Aurangzeb, who is going to be the descendant of Shah Jahan, and hate him. But I'm going to make an argument that maybe we shouldn't hate him that much. Maybe you agree, maybe you'll disagree. Let's move on and see here. Now, Aurangzeb actually kills his father, Shah Jahan, in order to take power. So, once again, we see an example of a son killing their father in order to take power, just like Salim the Grim did. Now, what Aurangzeb wants to do is he wants to expand the Mughal Empire. Instead of just being up to the north, he wants to expand it all the way down to the south, all the way down here as well. Now, why does he want to do so? Part of it is just, yeah, he wants more land, but think about it this way. Think about the Taj Mahal. That cost a whole lot of money. Now, that was a piece of architecture that maybe could get the people to have awe and be inspired by it, but it did cost a whole lot of money, a whole lot of tax dollars. And so Aurangzeb needs more tax dollars. Now, he can continue to tax the people he already has, but they're already mad at him because there's too many taxes. Think about what we just studied with Sikhism right here. And so he has to continue to move down and move to the south and try to take over. So, yes, he looks like a bad guy because he's engaging in war and fighting these people down here who really don't want to fight against him, but he needs their tax dollars in order to pay for his father's Taj Mahal. He also needs tax dollars to pay for all the wonderful things that his ancestor Akbar did as well. All of those places where all those coffee houses where Akbar gets to sit and just talk about things, well, someone's got to pay for them, and that person has to actually be Aurangzeb there. Now, what he does is he tries to use religious intolerance. Instead of allowing Hindus and Sikhs and all these different types of religions, he wants everyone to become Muslim. Why does he want to do so? Well, the reason he wants to do so is he wants to get everyone under one rule. These people who are not Muslim are rebelling against his empire over and over and over because of taxes, because of religion. And so he just wants to get everyone on the same page, everyone under the same religion, and maybe things will be peaceful. So it's very easy to look at Aurangzeb and say the reason that the Mughal Empire decline was because he was religiously intolerant and because he imposed a lot of taxes on those individuals. But it's also easy enough to see kind of the situation that Aurangzeb is in. We see that because of his ancestors' decisions, he has to do certain things. He has to he has to collect more taxes because he has to pay for all the things that Shah Jahan paid for and the Shah Jahan attempted to buy. So make sure that you're, whenever we're looking at history, that you're really looking at the complex situation that's around an individual. It's very easy to look at an individual and say they are either good or bad, but oftentimes there's a complex situation and there's complexities within their life that make them choose those certain decisions. And that's what we need to look at before we ultimately judge whether or not they're a good or bad person. Ladies and gentlemen, that's going to be the end of our lecture today. Make sure that you understand all three of the gunpowder empires. And then when we come to class, we'll actually have an opportunity to compare them to one another.